Language and society. We have several topics under language and society. Let me read to you this chapter in English. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. This is John 3:16 in the language of English. Now let me share with you this same verse in another language, which is Hawaii Creole Pidgin. So you probably found it a little bit amusing to read this or even to listen to this. So this is quite funny to you. This might sound so funny to you because this might be broken English. But this is a valid language. This is a real language. This is a language in Hawaii, and the kind of language in which this is what we call a Creole. So let me tell you what a Creole is. Let me start. Uh, you know that for the past decade, the past century, many Europeans have colonized other countries. Now there were times when the colonizer would get workers from different parts of the country they had colonized, and these workers speak different languages. Or sometimes they would get workers from other countries. Now, naturally, these people don't understand each other, but they need to communicate with each other. So that's the problem. They don't understand each other, but the closest language that they know, of which they themselves are not proficient in, is the colonizer's language. So, in the case of Hawaii, which came under American control, there was a time when the American administration decided to conduct a construction project or many other projects. And what the Americans did was to get people from Japan, from China, and even the Philippines, particularly from the northern part. And naturally, these people were brought together to do the construction project, and they could not understand each other. And that includes the local Hawaii population. The language they're most familiar with is the language of the colonizer, which is in this case English, and yet their understanding of English is very incomplete. And yet they need to communicate with each other, so they end up creating their own language, usually based on the colonizer's language, and it incorporates a lot of grammar, pronunciation, and words from that colonizer's language. Now, it's possible that this language that they have created, it may have some elements of other languages. This kind of language is called pidgin. Class, it's called pidgin. That's the language created by people who need to communicate with each other, but they don't have any common language. It's called pidgin. So Hawaii Creole English is was originally a pidgin. Now, when that language is passed on to the next generation, so the next generation would grow up speaking it as their first language, it comes to be called a Creole. So pidgin, if it's not yet passed on to to their children, to the next generation, but when it's passed on to the generation, it's now called a Creole. The word Creole class originally meant a European who grew up in a tropical country. Needless to say, it was a colonized country. So, in the Philippines, the Creoles were Spaniards who grew up in the Philippines. Here in the Philippines, they're called insulares, mean from the word insula, which is island. And the Spaniards who grew up in Spain, which is found in the Iberian Peninsula, were called peninsulares, or if it's singular, it's peninsular. So peninsulares, and insulares. So the insulares were Creoles. That's the original meaning of the word Creole. But now the word Creole means a pidgin language that was passed on to the next generation. Now that happened in Hawaii, that happened in many other countries, including the Philippines. So there was a time class when the Spaniards wanted a construction project, and they got people from Cavite, workers from Cavite. They took them to Zamboanga. Now, to do construction work. Naturally, the people of Zamboanga didn't understand them. The people from Cavite didn't understand the people in Zamboanga. The closest language they knew, of which they were not proficient, still not proficient, was Spanish. And so they created a language, the people in Zamboanga with the Caviteños, they created a language which is a pidgin language based on Spanish and with some elements of uh, indigenous languages, local languages. And later on, this was passed on to the next generation. So it became a Creole language. By the way, class, here's an example. I think it's in the video. We have the word for apple. The Chavacano word for apple is el manzanas. And el manzanas in Spanish is quite irritating to listen to because manzanas is both feminine and plural, but el is singular and masculine. So it should have been las manzanas, not el manzanas. But note, class, that this is not Spanish. This is Chavacano. So el manzanas is a valid word. It's a word in Chavacano. Same thing also happened in Papua New Guinea, where the colonizers were British, and so they spoke English. And the people, they also took people. The British also took people from different places in Papua New Guinea and put them to work. And the people in Papua New Guinea ended up creating a pidgin language, which they passed on to their children, making it a Creole language. And this language is Tokpisin, which is now the national language of Papua New Guinea. Now, class, I have an acquaintance who's married to somebody from Papua New Guinea. And she would always laugh at the language of the people from Papua New Guinea. She would laugh at Tokpisin because Tokpisin sounds like broken English. For example, the word for man is also man, but another word for man in Tokpisin is wampela. Wampela. From one fellow. One fellow, one fella, wampela. Okay, that's the Tokpisin word for man. Wampela. Or man. The word for woman in Tokpisin is Mary. The word for man is man or wampela. The word for woman is Mary. So it's kind of funny. And the woman would always laugh at her husband because the husband would speak something like broken English. Now, the husband, whose name was Victor, also told me that word for man is man, the word for woman is Mary, and the word for crowd is man Mary. Man Mary. That's the word for crowd. Notice how people try to build words for situations, basing it on their repertoire. Okay, you can say that Creole languages were created using translanguaging. They mixed the the people who spoke the pidgin language. They put together whatever language resource they were able to use, and we put them into that particular language. It's like jerry jerry rigging a particular project. Okay, like when you use different parts to create a particular project, that's jerry rigging. So you can argue that pidgins and creoles are jerry rigged languages. Okay, so those are what we call pidgins and creoles. So pidgins are languages that were created by different people who didn't speak a common language. And when they pass on that pidgin language to their children, it becomes what is called a Creole. So examples of Creole languages would be Hawaii Creole language, Hawaii Creole English, or Hawaii Pidgin, or and Chavacano in the Philippines, and Tokpisin in Papua New Guinea. Those are Creole languages. Those are valid languages, class. Okay, always remember those are valid languages. Okay. Oh, by the way, as for Hawaii Creole English, it's now a dying language because so much English is coming into Hawaii now. People in Hawaii are now shifting to English. That's why Hawaii Creole English is also a dying language now. Okay. Then we also have the concept of diglossia. Originally, when Ralph Ferguson formulated diglossia, he was only thinking of two versions of the same language, two different versions of the same language. As an illustration, in the Philippines, we have, for example, for written language, for the domain of written language, we use a separate version from the language that we use in spoken communication. For example, we use sapagkat and dahil in written language. By the way, class, written language is considered more formal than spoken language. Spoken language tends to be more informal. So, in written language, in Filipino, we use sapagkat, dahil. In spoken language, we use kasi and Mainit eh. But in written language, you don't say mainit eh. You say dahil mainit, sapagkat mainit. Okay? In oral language, you use kasi. You don't use that in formal language. In written language. Okay? You also use subalit, datupwat, ngunit when you write, which is a little more formal than spoken. But when you speak, you use pero. You don't use pero in written language. You don't use pero in formal situations. And you don't use subait or datapwat or ngunit in informal situations, informal domains. You also do not use sapagkat in spoken domains. Now, let me tell you an anecdote, class. I had a friend. She was from the Cordilleras. So naturally, she spoke Ilocano in her own mother tongue. Filipino, she learned from textbooks. And so she was not familiar with kasi, with with pero. Remember, she learned her Filipino, her Tagalog from textbooks. And there was a time when she went to Manila from the Cordilleras, from the Cordillera region. And she would speak to people in Manila. And because she got her Tagalog, her Filipino from textbooks, she would use sapagkat in in oral communication. Just imagine how funny that would have been to people she was talking with. Pasensya ka na, na-late ako, na-late ako sapagkat ma-traffic. Na-late ako sapagkat ma-traffic. So that would be very funny for people in Manila. Or, pupunta sana ako, ngunit umuulan. Pupunta sana ako rito, ngunit umuulan. So, that was quite weird for people hearing her use ngunit instead of pero. Okay? Because she got her Tagalog, her Filipino from textbooks. By the way, class, in the case of Ilocanos, is there an Ilocana here? Could you raise your hand? Ilocano. Si Clyde. Oh, si Clyde pala, Ilocano. Anyway, the Ilocanos class, they learned Tagalog through comic books, through comics, Wakasan comics. Okay? Now, comics is a little bit different in this case. It's written, but it's oral. It's the oral vision of it's the written version of oral. So you would have all those call outs in those comics. So it's even though it's written, it's not formal. Even though it's written, it's like spoken. So in comics, you don't use sapagkat, you use kasi or you use you don't use subalit datapwat ngunit you use pero in comic books, in comics. That's why the Ilocanos, they were able to to learn the right words for spoken Tagalog, because the Tagalog they got came from comics, unlike my friend from the Cordilleras who learned Tagalog from textbooks. Okay. Now it's possible also. Now there's a revision of that idea. Diglossia was expanded by Fishman to include not just versions of one language but different languages as well. Different languages as well. So in the case, for example, of Gibraltar, the country of Gibraltar, I think this was in your video, okay? In Gibraltar, you speak English in banks and other formal institutions, and they use Spanish on the street. You see, class, Gibraltar is a piece of rock a little bit to the south of Spain, but in the late 1800s, the British were able to capture it from Spain, because at that time Spain was a dying empire. And so the British were able to capture the island. Imagine, that was so near Spain, so far away from the UK, but the UK was able to conquer it. And they have held onto it up until now. But the people who lived there spoke Spanish. But then they had to use English because the British were in control of the government, in control of the banks and other institutions. So they had to use English in those domains. But they use Spanish on the street. So that's an example of diglossia. You use a particular language or version of a language in specific domains, and you use another language or another version of the same language in another domain. Maybe in the Tagalog region, you would have English in school, Tagalog at home, Tagalog in wet markets, English in higher government institutions. That's why the version that's used or the language that's used in the more prestigious domains like school or higher government institutions, it's called the H language. The language used or the version of the language used in less prestigious domains like the home, the wet market, the immediate community, the language is called the L language. Okay, if you live in Palawan, maybe in your home and in the immediate community, you would use Kuyunun, but in the marketplace, in the clinics, in the military bases, in the police stations, you would probably use Tagalog. In the Cordilleras, you would probably use your own language at home, maybe But Kalinga, and in the immediate community. But when you go into the city, you'd probably speak Ilocano. At school, you would probably speak Filipino, and English. And in many places, English. So that's the idea of diglossia, using a particular language or a particular version of a language in specific domains. Okay, that's diglossia. I don't know if you have any questions. Let's continue. Then we also have the concept of language versus dialect. Language is a speech form used by a people. Dialect refers to variations within that language. So you have in the Tagalog region, you have different dialects of Tagalog. You have Quezon Tagalog, you have Manila Tagalog, you have Camarines Norte Tagalog, you have Batangas Tagalog. You have Batangas Tagalog. Let me fix my monitor. Testing. Okay. So, a dialect is a variation within a language. And you know that two people are speaking a dialects of the same language if they can understand at least 70% of each other based on the inherent similarity between those two dialects. They should understand each other 70%, at least 70% of each other based on the similarity, the sheer similarity between their speech, and not because they learned each other's speech. Okay? Now, in the case of Tagalog, the people from Batangas, they could understand people from Quezon, from Manila. They understand other dialects. That's an example of what we call L simplex. In Bicol and the Visayas, the situation is quite different. It's the adjacent towns that understand each other. So if you belong to a town, the next town, you would probably understand them, maybe at least 70%. But the next town, you will no longer understand, or you would find it difficult to understand them. And the town after that, you don't understand their dialect anymore. And yet, they are dialects of the same language. So their dialects, even though uh, one town is far from the other and they couldn't understand each other anymore, but they refer to the same parent language, they can be considered dialects of the same language. Now, class, in the border between Germany and the Netherlands, there are communities, when you listen to them, you don't know if they speak German or Dutch. You'll just have to ask them, oh, to which language is your dialect? Oh, they would say our our language here, our dialect here is a dialect of Dutch. Maybe you would go to the next town and they would tell you, you also wonder if their dialect is Dutch or German. If you spoke German, if you spoke Dutch, you still wouldn't be able to discern if their language, if their dialect is a dialect of German or dialect of Dutch. So in that case, it's the people who will tell you what the parent language is. Okay? That's the that's another way of interpreting the word dialect. Still another way of uh, defining the word dialect is political. So in the case, for example, of China, it's Mandarin that is considered a language, and all the other languages in China are considered dialects of Mandarin. So Kunming dialect is a dialect, Hokkien is a dialect, Cantonese is a dialect of Mandarin, which is not linguistically true because they are different languages. They don't understand each other 70%. Okay, but that is a political definition of language. That is a political definition of language. Okay, so that's language versus dialect. Now, between dialects, there are dialects that are more prestigious. There are dialects which are not prestigious. And the most prestigious dialect is called the acrolect, and the least prestigious dialect is the basilect. Somewhere between that, those two, the language, the dialects between those two are what we call mesolects. Meso means middle or between. So the dialects that are between acrolect and basilect in terms of prestige are what we call mesolect. So class, in Germany, the dialect of German in which Martin Luther translated the Bible became what is called High German. It became the acrolect. The other German dialects were considered Low German. So you have High German and Low German. The dialect in which Martin Luther translated the Bible is called the acrolect. It's called High German. Now here in the Philippines, probably the acrolect could be Bulacan Tagalog because that is where many poets live, and many poems and prestigious works were written in Bulacan, Tagalog. That's the birthplace of Balagtasan. So we'd probably say that Bulacan Tagalog is the acrolect. Although you could also argue that maybe Manila Tagalog is the acrolect because politically it's the capital, and usually the language of the capital becomes the language of the country. And because it's the capital, the language spoken there is so very much prestigious. So maybe you can say Manila Tagalog is the acrolect. As for the base select class, maybe if you ask me, I would probably say the ones in East Manila, the dialects in Rizal. There are many dialects in Rizal. You have the Binangonan, Baras, Teresa, Morong, Tanay, and they all have their different ways of speaking. They have their dialects. For example, in Binangonan, oftentimes the D is pronounced as an R. So bundok is bunrok, sandok is sanrok, tawid is tawir. And in fact, class, you could actually see it in their signboards. So bawal tumawir dito. You see a lot of that in Binangonan. And which means that it's a different dialect from other dialects, and it tends to be looked down. So people from those places, when they go to other places, they drop their dialect. They drop the markers of their dialect. Okay, so those areas probably they would be considered the baselect. The dialect spoken in those areas are baselect. Okay, so that's acrolect, baselect, and mesolect. Language shift is when another language takes the place of the traditional language in more and more domains. Domains are communicative events. It could be, it's dictated by the situation, the place, the purpose, and the participants. You have the home, you have the market, the immediate community, the school. You're in school and you are on session. You're in school and you're in recess. Those are two different domains. Or it could be church or government offices. Now when another language takes over that domain, when people start speaking the new language more and more, and the traditional language less and less, and in fewer and fewer domains, until the last domain in which the traditional language is spoken is the home. That's language shift. Okay. So language shift is when speakers prefer another language in more and more domains. So examples of speakers who speak another language in place of their traditional language would be the Kapampangans. So in Pampanga, because of the influx of many Tagalog speakers, the people in Pampanga keep speaking, they speak Tagalog more and more now, and they speak Kapampangan less and less. And there are even children now who can't speak Kapampangan. That's also true in Pangasinan, in Pangasinense, because of migration. There's a lot of contact from more dominant languages. And it's true in the case of Negrito groups. Now, for the case of Negrito groups, it's because their forest is now being destroyed. They now have to work in casual labor for people outside their community. So the language that they use is continually dying because the culture is also dying. So there are several reasons for language shift. Okay, one reason for language shift is economic opportunity, particularly for tourism class. When your area becomes a tourist attraction, the parents would want to the parents would want their kids to speak the dominant language, the language that would give them more economic opportunity. Definitely, if you can speak only your own traditional language, which is not spoken by tourists, you're at a much more disadvantage economically. You can't you can't serve as a waiter, you cannot serve as a tourist guide, you cannot even serve as a vendor, as a peddler, because you can't communicate with tourists. While those who are able to speak the other language, they have more economic opportunities. So that's one big reason. That's also what's happening when Negritos lose their traditional forest. They now have to relate or contact outsiders in order to get the resources that was traditionally available in their own places. There are other perceived advantage like prestige. Okay, yes, that could be one reason. Still another reason is migration in and out. So when there's a big influx of outsiders and they speak a dominant language, there's a tendency for the people, the minority group, to shift to the language of the dominant speakers. It's also a very common case also is when a family moves out of their language community, they migrate to another place and they lose their own language. There's a tendency for them to lose the language. Okay. In the case of the Negritos, for example, you've read basketballs for bows and arrows. No Negrito could speak. No Negrito could use the bows and arrows anymore. Wala nang gumagamit ng bows and arrows. Whereas 50 years ago, 40 years ago, all the Agta in Kasiguran are able to use bows and arrows. But now they cannot because their environment is depleted now. So the cultural processes that they have, like hunting, gathering, tracking, and all the terms that are embedded, that are used for such processes, they're disappearing. The terms for objects are also disappearing. In Kasiguran Agta, by the way, the author of the article Basketballs for Bows and Arrows was an acquaintance of mine. Although he's deceased now, he's passed on. He has passed away. His name is Thomas Headland, and he told me that many of the young people in Kasiguran, the Agta in Kasiguran, they've lost the they've lost the knowledge of certain trees. They no longer know the word for this tree, the Agta word for that tree. They've forgotten words for certain animals. They've forgotten words for certain processes. So that is something sad, class, very sad. Because when you lose a language, you lose a rooted identity, like Joshua Fishman once said. When a language is lost from humanity, it's like removing one instrument from an orchestra and replacing it with a violin. So you have an orchestra and you remove the French horn, you replace it with a violin. Remove the trumpet, you replace it with a violin. You remove the English horn, you replace it with a violin. You remove the clarinet, no more clarinet, just violin. So the sound isn't as harmonious. It's not as beautiful, class. I wonder, class, if you've listened to the Pambansang Awit played by a band. There's a part there, sa dagat at bundok, sa simoy at sa langit mong bughaw. There's a part there where you would hear a whistle because in the band there's a whistle also. One of the instruments in the band is a whistle. And when I listen to that part and I hear the whistle, I find it so beautiful. But there were cases where I would listen to the Pambansang Awit and there's a part there where the whistle isn't played. And when I listen to that part, it's not as beautiful as when there's a whistle. There's a pump. There's a place in the Pambansang Awit where you use the band players. One of the band players would play a whistle, and sometimes the whistle is not available. It's not played, so it's not as beautiful. Okay, maybe if it's like that, you still don't notice, but as you go along, becomes worse, uh, that's the only time that people start noticing. So the same thing with language shift. People are not aware of it until it's in a worse off situation. Yung grabe na. Okay? So concomitant to language shift and language death is cultural depletion. And in many cases, it's accompanied by environmental destruction. So the AGTA, instead of hunting and gathering, they now have to engage in labor. And they now have more, they need to contact, they need to interact with many outsiders. And of course, they receive a lot of discrimination. When it comes to labor, they get paid less than laborers from other ethnic groups. And the AGTA develop a liking for that are not their own. They now want to wear jeans. They now want to wear watches. They now want to use cell phones. But then that requires a lot of money. And the AGTA simply cannot have that by through casual labor. They now have to use cooking oil. They now have to use soy sauce and patis, wherein a long time ago, they just put the snail on top of fire and they eat it. The birds, they just remove the feathers, some of the innards, and they cook it over fire and they're able to eat. But now they have to cook it with cooking oil and all that. So they're now shifting to a cash-based economy where they have a lot of contact with other people and they cannot simply assimilate, unlike other people groups. So their language shift is so much more terrible than other cases, because even if you let them wear t-shirts and jeans, they would still stand out because of their curly hair, their short height, and their black skin. And they would be discriminated against. Okay, I had when I visited Palanan town, um, the owner of the resort where I lived had an Agta boy that he was financing. He was the benefactor of the Agta boy who was studying in the local school. But then one day the Agta boy told him he no longer wanted to study. It was it was sad because this boy was actually bright, but he didn't want to study anymore. He just wanted to become a servant. And the owner of the resort told me maybe it was because he would receive a lot of harassment in the school. Okay, so that's a sad case, okay, of the AGTA. Also, in Palanan town, there's by the way, I'm talking about a different town, okay, from Kasiguran, from basketballs and bows and arrows. This is a nearby AGTA group in Palanan. And I went there for my dissertation. I met an AGTA man. He was actually familiar with the healing practices of the AGTA, using using herbs. And he told me that he would boast that he would even say that their medical products are actually more effective than Western medicine. But then I would ask him, have you passed this on to your children? And he said no. That was so sad. They're about to lose that knowledge because of language shift. Because the forest is depleted, you have to go far away, deep into the forest to get the resources that once were readily available. His children were very busy in school. They couldn't go deep into the forest. And so he has not passed on. He's already old, but he has not passed on that knowledge of herbals to his children. Very sad. Okay, so we will read an article. This article is about Palanan, the place I went to for my dissertation. By the way, class, let me first talk to you about Palanan Isabela. Palanan Isabela, if you know your history, that's where Emilio Aguinaldo hid from the Americans. It's so isolated, he tried to hide there. You know, Palanan, there's no road to Palanan. It's an isolated town. The way to get to Palanan could be three ways. One way is to take an expensive airline flight, small, short airplane flight, 20 minutes, a 20-minute flight or 25-minute flight from Kawayan Airport to Palanan. There's an airstrip there. There's a small airport there. But the cost is 7,000, at times 7,000 pesos. Imagine 7,000 pesos for a 20-minute flight. 7,000 pesos, you can go to Hong Kong for that. But that's how expensive it is. That's the most expensive, but it's also the easiest route, but also the deadliest route, because there are many planes that crashed on mountainsides, particularly those small airplanes that don't have a particular navigating device. When there's a lot of cloud cover, you can have the misfortune of crashing there. Recently, a few months ago, there was a Cessna that crashed there. Another option is to trek through the forest for 3 days. You will walk for 3 days from Ilagan, from near Kawayan to Palanan. That's 3 days of walking. Definitely not viable for me. Also, um, another one is to take an 8-hour boat ride, small boat ride, pump boat, through the tumultuous Pacific Ocean. By the way, class, I grew up by the coast. I grew up by the coast, and I'm used to riding small boats in choppy waters. But when I took a boat in the Pacific, still a lot more tumultuous, because in Coron, in Palawan, all the waves, they come from one direction and they are round shaped. So even though they're big, you can manage them. But in Palanan, in the Pacific Ocean, the waves come from everywhere. So in short, Palanan is an isolated town, but now there's a road being built to Palanan town. Now the problem with that, it has a lot of advantages, but the disadvantage is there will be an influx of many tourists and many other people, and that would put a strain on the culture of the Agta. Okay, can I ask to read the first, uh, the first few paragraphs?
Palanan, Philippines. There is no road to Palanan. The town, 190 miles northeast of Manila on a stretch of rugged Pacific coastline, is separated from the crowds and chaos of the rest of the Philippines by a 3-day trek through tropical jungle, a 7-hour ride on a wooden pump boat, or a 25-minute flight on a 3-seater Cessna. Cloistered in the foothills of the Sierra Madre, Palanan's farmers cross fields on the backs of loping water buffaloes. Children in plaid uniforms walk to school along beaches of white sand. A few motorcycles with sidecars, brought in on boats, rumble through the careless streets of the dusty town center. Carved canoes slide down broad rivers, and narrow outrigger boats bob along the shore.
Thank you very much. By the way, that's carless, okay? Carless streets. Walang
Ah,
kotse doon
careless.
masyado.
Okay.
Okay? Walang masyadong kotse doon. Very, very few cars there. Merong konting motorsiklo, tricycle brought in by bangka. Okay? But all that may change. The government is building a road that will cut a path of more than 50 miles through the Sierra Madre from Ilagan City, the capital of Isabela province, to Tivilacan, a neighboring town, with plans to continue it into Palanan and the scattering of nearby villages. By the way, this was written several years ago. The road has been built, but it was poorly built, so it was destroyed immediately and it had to be closed again and uh, it had to be rebuilt. I'm not sure whether it's available now. The road comes with many hopes. If stocks of rice run low during the rainy season, they can be replenished relatively more easily. Dry goods like sugar and packaged crackers will become cheaper because you don't need so much effort to take the sugar and the other stuff from Manila, from other places. It will be easier to take sick people to the hospital in Ilagan. Okay? And with new access to markets on the other side of the mountains, locals envision planting yams, cassava, watermelons, or bananas which they could transport by truck. Our lives could become less burdensome, said Bulol Donato, a member of the AGTA, an indigenous group in the Sierra Madre. By the way, this guy, Bulol Donato, I've met him personally. To read this one?
Am I clear po?
Yes.
But others fear that even as the road brings economic benefits, including tourism, it will put pressure on traditional ways of life and bring in outside ills. Palanang's population of about 17,000 consists of the Agta, an ethnic, an ethnic group descended from the Philippines' earliest inhabitants who came to the archipelago 30,000 to 60,000 years ago, the Paranan, a group that arrived 4,000 years ago, and more recent arrivals.
So we have the Palanan Agta. They call themselves Palanan. The language that they use is called Pahanan. Those are the Agta. Then we have the Austronesians who arrived 4,000 years ago. Mga Kayumanggi. Ano? Yung mga Agta, mga itim. Yung mga Paranan ay Kayumanggi. They arrived 4,000 years ago. And they have a language called Paranan. So the Agta have Pahanan, they have Paranan, and they're closely related in terms of lexicon, in terms of vocabulary. But the road could put pressure on traditional ways of life. That's the problem, particularly with tourism class. Tourism has many benefits, but it has also many negative things. For one thing, when you have your place suddenly becomes touristy, the prices would go up. The prices of goods, the prices of rent, the price of transportation will also increase because of competition. Second, there's a pressure on the language because parents would prefer that their children would use the language that would benefit them most economically. Okay, the language that gives them more access to economic power is the language that they would want to speak. And definitely it's not the traditional language. Rather, it's the language of the tourists. So parents would want their children to speak more and more the language of the tourists. And because of that contact, there's a lot of contact with people who speak another language. There's pressure on the traditional language to be lost.
Many Agda continue to live in huts made of branches and dried leaves as semi-nomadic hunter-gatherers, diving for octopus and lobster, spearing reef fish, trapping wild boar, and hunting deer. For thousands of years, they have maintained friendly trade relationships with the Paranan and other migrants, trading fish and meat for rice, and more recently for instant coffee, beer, crystal earrings, t-shirts, and cotton dresses. Arnold Alvarez, 53, an evangelical pastor in Palanan, worries that excitement over the road is obscuring the harsh reality that with the good will come the bad, particularly for the Agda. Their way of life won't survive the road, he said. It's hard now and it will be harder once the road comes.
So their way of life will be affected. By the way, class, sabi nung teacher ko, nung my dissertation advisor who also worked on the AGTA, he would say, yung mga AGTA, kapag nagutom sila, kakain. Kapag inantok, matutulog. That's how simple their life was. And as part of their culture, the AGTA didn't believe in land ownership. They had no concept of land ownership. Here in Cavite, where I live, so many murders have happened because of land disputes. But for the AGTA, there's no there's no murder. There's very little murder because people didn't think much of possessions, of ownership, particularly land. Here in our places, there are brothers, sisters, siblings who kill each other, cousins who kill each other because of land disputes. For the Agta, that's not a problem. But because of their contact, they're now slowly learning the culture of the dominant group. So they now have a concept of land ownership. Let me ask you read for us the next two paragraphs.
So about 1,800 Agta live in the Sierra Madre, and since at least the start of the 20th century, their population has grown slowly. That leaves some anthropologists concerned that Agta culture is facing possible extinction, particularly as hunter-gatherer societies, which depend on forests and ocean products, are vulnerable to changes in their environment. The Sierra Madre is susceptible to illegal logging and wildlife poaching, both of which are expected to worsen as the road makes the virgin forests and shores more accessible. And the arrival of migrants from surrounding provinces, drawn by open spaces and new economic opportunities, might leave the Agta vying for limited natural resources as the forest is cleared for farmland.
You know, class, the missionaries there, usually the Agta, by the way, are highly influenced by evangelicals. Their places are being stolen from them. They have beautiful beaches there, but like one pastor once told me, ang labanan kasi dito papel. Because they don't have the legal papers, they cannot prove that they own the land. And that's taken advantage by politicians and other powerful people with the help of the institution that was supposed to help them, the National Commission on Indigenous People. Doon lang siguro kami nagkapareho ni Duterte. Ano yung galit namin sa NCIP. Doon lang kami magkapareho ni Duterte, ni Rodrigo Duterte. Anyway, the that institution, that agency that was supposed to help the AGTA are actually the ones taking advantage of the AGTA. Okay, now the evangelical missionaries there bought a 16-hectare piece of land, titled it, and gave it to the AGTA. That was a godsend because of that, the AGTA are able to live relatively undisturbed. But if you notice, outside of that 16-hectare piece of land, there are other people encroaching on the land already. Okay, and also the forests that they lived in, they now have competition from other people. The rivers that they fished in, they have competition from other people using more powerful tools and instruments. The Agta hardly use nets, but the other people use nets. So in terms of competition, they lose out. Also, the Agta one Agta told me in the past, for one hunting expedition, they could catch 5 wild boar. But now he told me you would be lucky to catch just one. Also, other people when they try to trap wild boar, they put bombs in yams sa gabi na kinakain ng wild boar, the wild boar eat. But then it's not only the wild boar who eat yams. Sometimes people also, particularly the gabi. Just imagine you pick up a gabi, you pick up a yam, and it explodes. That's terrible. Okay. Also, the beaches that they live in, they get taken from them. I met uh I met a group of Agta. They're now living in just one piece of narrow strip of beach. They're not allowed to go further inland or go somewhere nearby because it's already fenced off by the new owner. So terrible for them. As an indigenous group, the Agta can apply to claim vast tracts of the Sierra Madre as their ancestral land, which they first did in 1997. It's called the CADT, Certificate of Ancestral Domain Title. Previous applications have failed, however, and the group's most recent effort to secure land rights has been tied up in government bureaucracy for over a decade. Without legal rights to the land, the AGTA risk having it claimed by others. So mas madali, it's so much easier for another person to apply for land titling, which is happening. There's a lot of advertisements. If you visit the websites related to Palanan, Isabela, there are many advertisements of land being sold, being advertised. Those are land of the Agta, and they're being titled by other people. You know, the Agta, they're not very good in in all those process. Yung paglalakad ng papel, they cannot do that. Going to government offices and submitting all these papers, they cannot do that. But other people can do, so they lose out. Plus the NCIP, which is supposed to help them, don't help them. Rather, they side with the politicians, the powerful people. Okay? In Palanan, which the mayor said in which the town's mayor said was visited by nearly 300 Filipino tourists and a dozen foreign tourists last year. Emerald jungles are laced with clear streams that empty into the dense lake blue of the Pacific. Beautiful beaches. Wide beaches are crisscrossed by hermit crabs. Wow, hermit crabs. I really like hermit crabs. In extravagant shells, and vibrant coral reefs are visible through pristine waters. The beauty of the coast has not escaped the notice of developers hoping to attract more tourists. Yan, inaagaw. Last year in Dimasal, Lansan, an area of white sand and rugged rocky outcroppings, the Agta who lived there were told that a resort would be built in anticipation of the road, and the government asked them to leave. Some were given cement houses in the town, though many continued to live on huts by the beach, closer to their foraging. Dedi Malakasta, 60, an Agta pastor who has lived in Dimasalansan, said that when the mayor asked locals to leave, they did so without a fight. Nevertheless, he said, we don't want our own land grabbed away from us. So yun, inaagaw sa kanila. Okay. Renee Hagen, a Dutch anthropologist with the University of California, who studied Agta in the Sierra Madre, said the group had long acquiesced to the decisions of government officials. It's very difficult for them to oppose anything, she said. They feel that they don't have say in local issues, and in practice, they don't really. Mr. Malacasta wants to fight for land rights in court, although he lacks the money to do so. He dreams that one day Agta children will go on to college, maybe even become lawyers so they can stand up for Agta rights. We can't always be afraid, he said. That's a really long shot for an Agta to become a lawyer. On a quiet stretch of beach in Dipagiden, I've been there by the way, Norma Plata, who is about 55, sat recently with her husband and children. The beach where she sat, where she was born, and where she gave birth to her children was sold last year to a doctor from Kawayan City, just over the mountains, who wants to build a resort there. When that happens, she and her tribe will walk over to another patch of unclaimed sand and set up their huts there. We can't go far from the sea, she said. We will die of hunger. So it's very sad for the Agta. Their land is being taken from them, and their culture, which is tied to land, is being lost. By the way, there are two kinds of Agta. The Agta, the mountain Agta, and the coastal Agta. The coastal Agta, they have lots of contact with outsiders, so they're losing their language a lot. I mean, there's a lot of stress on their language, and many of them are losing their language. But the mountain Agta, although they're isolated, they have less contact, they have more language maintenance, they have more language vitality, they have other problems, particularly loggers. And until recently, armed rebels. It's a good thing that Palanan soil is not good for mining. Otherwise, it would be mining there too. Okay, so language shift is such a sad thing. Okay, so the end of language shift is language death when no one speaks the language anymore. By the way, class, have you noticed the what do you call this? The Badjao. So many Badjao in Manila now. I'm sure you know why the Badjao have gone to Manila. You know the Badjao, they're marine nomads. If the Agta are nomadic people in forests, the Badjao are nomadic people on the sea. They move from one part of the sea to another. But then the seas have been destroyed, polluted, destroyed, the resources depleted, and so many pirates now want to take advantage of them. So they have left their place and they've been uprooted. They live in Manila now, where in the National Capital Region, where they are abused, okay, and discriminated against. The end of language shift is language death. This could be in the Philippines. This includes Central Tagbanwa, Dicamay Agta, Catabaga, Tayabas Agta, Villaviciosa Agta. In the case of Dicamay Agta, I've met a missionary who one I there was this missionary who wrote that he 30 years ago he went to Dicamay and he met Agta who spoke Dicamay Agta. When he went back 30 years later, he could no longer find Agta who could speak Dicamay. So language death is so sad. It's like removing a shade of color. When you remove a particular shade of color, the painting, the picture isn't as beautiful. But you can't notice that for many people, they can't notice that until it's further along, when it's already worsening. Okay. Now, language death is when no one speaks the language. That's different from language change. Latin, for example, is considered a dead language, but maybe it's not really dead. Maybe it has changed to several languages, particularly what we call the Romance languages. The Romance languages have descended from Latin. They're probably uh, Latin that has changed. Okay. Examples are Spanish, Italian, Sardinian, Portuguese, and many other languages. Sanskrit, although it's a dead Indian language, maybe it has actually changed into other Indian languages. Okay, if we have language shift, we also have language maintenance. This is when you choose to speak the traditional language in face of competition from another, usually more dominant language. This is a present action activity. Okay, remember that. Reasons for language maintenance could be maintaining affinity. You decide to maintain to use your language, to remember your language, to speak it because you want to talk with your lola, with your lolo, with the people around you or in the provinces. Even when you're in Manila, you're you're a member of a language minority, you still preserve your language because you want to be able to speak with your relatives. Another one is pride. Because you are proud of your language, you keep on using your language, like many people in the Cordillera. Okay? Still, another concept is language vitality. This is a future phenomenon in contrast to language maintenance, which is a present phenomenon. Language vitality is the probability that a language will be spoken by the next generation. How likely is your language to be spoken by the next generation? That may be in question if you speak a minority language. And then you also have ethno-linguistic vitality, which is how a speech group acts in situations where there are other groups in contact. How do Visayans act? How, do they still speak Visayan? How does a minority community act when there are other people groups? Do they hide their language? Do they shift to another language? That's ethno-linguistic vitality. Then we studied argot, which is the language of people under stress from the greater society, such as gays, religious minorities, ethnic minorities, truck drivers, van drivers who use codes. They use it because they want they don't want others to understand them, and which is why argot is fast changing. It changes quickly because when people from that group realize that other people understand their words, they change another word. Or maybe because it's no longer a mark of their ethnicity. Like uh, black singers in the past, they would wiggle their head from left to right. But when other singers started doing that, the black singers stopped doing that. Okay, so that's argot. And then finally, we discussed code switching, which is shifting from one language to another, maybe between sentences. That's in intersentential, and intrasentential, which is within the sentence. Okay, so let me stop sharing.